appreciate you coming back. For those who've come back, and if you're here for the first time, I'm going to review just for a moment, because I know yesterday there was a lot of numbers and a lot of things that were brought up. Just trying to understand a process over time from beginning of a conversation all the way through to announcing change, to implementing change, to today. You have several points on the timeline that are of interest. The first thing we talked about was just understanding numbers, and I want to just spend about 30 seconds on this. And the idea was that there are things that happen in the world that are just completely random. There's nothing really acting on it to cause an effect. And so if you flip a coin, 50% of the time you're going to get heads. 50% of the time you're going to get tails. It's completely random. Now every once in a while you're going to flip a quarter and you are actually going to get heads 3 times in a row, 4 times in a row, 5 times in a row, 6 times in a row, but it's statistically very unlikely. You're not going to do that on a regular basis. Now, if you flip a coin 85 times in a row and it's on heads every time, you will know with absolute certainty something's wrong with this coin. Because the statistical probability of that happening is so slim and it's so consistent that you would just know that there's something acting on this coin. It's weighted, it's 2 heads on both sides. Something's going on that's not normal. Something's affecting the outcome. So when we talk about statistical significance, we're talking about outcomes that are so outside the normal range of probability that you can say with some certainty, say with 95+% certainty, that number doesn't work that way at random except for, say, 5% of the time. And once we get to the point of saying this only happens randomly 5% of the time, then we begin to feel comfortable saying something's probably going on, especially if you have reason to believe it works that way. Through experience, through other people's research and things like that, you begin to put together your ideas and your hypothesis with the actual data that gives it some credibility to say, because again, if I do 100 experiments, if I run 100 calculations with 5% being my number, that I want to be 95% sure, that means 5% can still happen random happenstance. Just by random chance, just like the quarter flipping 8 times in a row, you might do that once in your life. That's still a random event. So we get to a point of saying, this is so far outside what's probable, plus my hunch and my gut were already telling me something was probably there, that I feel comfortable saying there's something going on here that's significant. Something's affecting the outcome. So when we talk about a correlation, we're talking about a relationship. As one goes up, the other goes up. Or as one goes down, the other goes down. That's called a positive correlation. A negative correlation is as one goes up, the other goes down. Positive correlation in life, as people on average get taller, they get heavier. Negative correlation in these numbers was as attendance drops, people's assessment of the outcome, the negativity of the outcome goes up. In other words, I'm going to have a more negative view of the outcome if we lost a lot of people. If we gained some people, if we kind of held steady, we didn't lose as many, then you're going to have a more positive. The trend is you're going to have a more positive view toward the outcome. So let's just review a few things here really quick about yesterday. I've condensed the slides down so they're not multi-step and you can kind of get to it pretty quick. The first thing was I want you to know who we're talking about here so that you know who the numbers are representative of. This was not a random sampling of 100 churches of Christ with 1,000 people. It was like these are congregations who have actually implemented change. Not thought about change and didn't do it, not never thought about change. These are congregations that actually went and did something that was from a non-traditional approach. And the people who responded had to be still present in that congregation. I didn't want people in the survey who said, yeah, I was at this church 10 years ago and my impression of what's going on today is I hear this. I didn't want any of that. These people still have to be present. And so we got 87 responses, 47 congregations. Within that, 73% males, 26% female, mostly ministers, a few members, and some elders thrown into the mix. This is also very important. Who are we talking about here? 95% are personally supportive of the change. Again, these are congregations that have actually made the change, okay? And so as you're coming at these numbers, understand these are churches that have made the change. The responses are from mostly ministers, mostly male ministers, some female ministers, mostly male elders, a couple female elders, and some members, male and female, who have been through the change and are still in the congregation, which by default makes them, as you would think, more supportive. They haven't gone anywhere. Okay, so here's where we left off. Comparing today against when the changes were implemented, here's on the contribution end, okay? 43% reported a lower contribution, losing contribution, 29% stayed the same, 28% gained. Okay, this is today versus implement, today versus when the changes actually took place. Okay, of those who lost, 43% lost. The average loss of contribution was 24%. Now, I did not ask this, if you're going to go into your question, I did not ask this at announcement and implementation. I just asked it on the end. When you actually made the change, what happened to the numbers? Okay, of the 28% that gained, the average gain was 10%. And again, I think a lot of those churches were already on a growth track. Of the gaining churches, were already on very much a growth track. And we already said that attendance up and down is correlated with results. If attendance goes down, results tend to people feel worse about it. Now, what was interesting about that is contribution did not correlate with those same things. That's really interesting. So when people leave, it impacts people's perceptions of what happened. When the money goes down, it doesn't have the same effect. I thought that was really interesting. It kind of, in our minds, people are more important than money. Is the budget getting met or not? Well, I don't know, but Susie's not here anymore, or John left, or or however that goes, Find that to be pretty interesting. Now, this kind of struck me because I was kind of noticing as I was kind of going through the numbers what seemed to kind of be fairly consistent here. How about contribution per attendee? Because it felt like of churches that were losing members, that the contribution, and just kind of as I was kind of kept looking at the numbers without running anything, but I kept going up through the columns and making calculations and things, and it just felt like the contribution numbers were not going down as fast as the attendance numbers. I kept saying, well, let me just see. Let's look at it. Okay, so pre-change, the average contribution per attendee was 34.18. So if you take their total attendance and you divide it with the contribution, $34.18 per attendee. Does that make sense? Okay, post-change, 36.53. So after the changes, they may be down, some of these churches, or was it 43%, down in attendance. But the people who remain increase their giving. Does that make sense? By 7%. I mean, you still have a budget to meet. That didn't change, right? Okay. And the people who are still there really probably believe in the cause and this sort of thing and are still there. Contribution per attendee went down for 40%, but went up by 50% of the churches and went up significantly in many of those churches, actually, quite significantly. Okay, now this is a really interesting one, and I only have a few more slides, and we'll ask some questions here. One of the things I've mentioned so far as being related to outcome, positive outcome, negative outcome, is length of time since implementation. Now this is really, really important. I don't want you to miss this. Scripture was also when you ask the question, how important was Scripture in your process? From extremely important, neutral, not important, extremely unimportant, That level, that 1 through 5 Likert scale, correlated with some things. The more Scripture was emphasized in the process, the better the general attitude toward the changes were. I think that is extremely important. The more Scripture was emphasized, the effectiveness, the attitude, the works, all those, the outcome variables all improved with Scripture, the level of Scripture being more emphasized than less. The less Scripture was emphasized, the more poor the outcome variables tended to be. Okay. All right, and now we get back again to, well, it's kind of fun to report what was significant, but what was not significant? Because we can get kind of tied up on a lot of things and say, well, we got to make sure this, we got to make sure that, or this is really important or not. Well, maybe some of it's not as important as we tend to think. And again, what I want to get you to see here is what I'm trying to do in these two sessions, I'm trying to be descriptive. I'm not trying to be prescriptive. You go to the pharmacy and get your prescription, right? It's going to do something. It's going to tell you, they're going to give you instructions, and you're going to take this pill. I'm trying to be descriptive. I'm trying to say, what is happening out there? How is it going down? What are the impacts? How are people feeling about it? Because you hear a lot of stuff, and there's nothing behind really any of it other than here's kind of what I think or how I feel or what happened over here. So length of study did not correlate with outcomes. So in other words, since this is not prescriptive, don't think to yourself, well, then if we just had less study, I mean, that's not really the point. As we said, more emphasis of Scripture is better. Okay? Which makes sense in our fellowship. That's what we're all about. Scripture is highly, highly important and valued. Length of study did not correlate with attendance numbers, contribution numbers, attitude of people, any of that. Length of implementation didn't correlate. In other words, if we just took longer, more people might be on board or whatever. It's like, that didn't correlate either. And again, the age of the congregation, it did correlate with attendance, but it didn't correlate with anything else. Didn't correlate with attitudes or any of that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's look at a few things here. These are people who have been through making the changes. They're on the other side of this on some level. Maybe some are still in the middle of it. What is your change in support level from when you first began implementing this? 53% more supportive, 39% stayed the same, and 3% less supportive. Now that's interesting, because we just said, what's the percentage? I mean, we're talking for some, for slightly under half are losing some contribution and losing some members, and they're still saying this is still in their mind. I mean, it seems to me they're saying we still feel like this is the right course of action. Maybe even more supportive, half more supportive. Okay, we've already kind of gone over that. Now I'll mention the second point on this slide. The more years since the change is correlated with the older members and their attitude, but not the younger. And that makes some sense. I mean, because the younger members, you're talking teens and 20s. If you've been at this for 10 years, 5, 10 years, I mean, they might have been 7 when you started, 6. I mean, the older 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s have increased better attitude over time as well, whereas the younger people don't exhibit that correlation. Okay, so how about attendance today? Today, the 40% are still experiencing a lower percentage than when they first started talking about this, 60% being either the same or higher. I wish I had gotten those two broken down. I'm sorry for that. How about contribution? 43% are still lower today than they were at implementation. 29% are hanging steady. 29% are actually at a gain in contribution since implementation today. This is today's numbers. Where are we at versus what you reported when all this kind of got started off? What if you got a do-over?
Good question.
Would you do it? What do you think?
Yes.
Yes? How about that? 90%. Yes. Well, what would you do different? 49%, nothing. 26%, move faster. Now remember, what was the average length of study?
8 months.
Or 8 months. You're right. Average length of study was 8 months. 8 months. Average length of implementation was 8 years. Okay. So yeah. Okay. Move faster. Move slower. 1%. Actually, need to take more time. And I would be curious to look at that 1% and say, what was their process? Might have been the person that says, I don't know where the change came from, and nothing was said, and Scripture wasn't. I mean, who knows? I'd be. Okay, change in volunteerism, because there's a lot of things that get said about stuff like this. Change in volunteerism. Well, we're just doing this because the men aren't doing anything. You ever hear that? 68% increased participation, 28% no change. So people are not backing off participating for the most part. Did you experience a change in male participation? Increased 15%, no change 79, and 6% had a decrease. That tells you a lot, because that said a lot, I think. I've heard that repeatedly. Okay, did you know that 6% of churches that go through this experience a decrease in male participation? That's an important number. What would you say? Changes in numbers of visitors. Some still 51% are actually reporting an increase in visitors post-change. And again, keep in mind, some of this is church plants that are probably going to grow from the get-go. Some of these are churches that are already in a growth mode, that are continuing to grow. I'm gonna answer that and add one piece to that. Okay, I did break that down and look at that, and I did not find. In other words, you run what's called, again, an analysis of variance that says these are two discrete groups. You either did this or you did that, And there was no statistical difference in the outcome variables of churches that did these various levels of implementation. Now again, and I say this cautiously, but I'm not pointing at any individual that took the survey. I'm talking about 87 responses on a general level. Remember the sample. You've always in statistics, remember your sample, right? Because these are 95% people who are supportive of the change, who are self-reporting back on their experience of congregational engagement, attitude, effectiveness, all those sorts of things. Outcome variables are being self-reported by people who are mostly ministers and elders, although they might be even more sensitive to that, honestly. But they are for this. You know what I mean? So that's why when we talked about yesterday, the gentleman here and someone right here, we talked about the need to get more member data. Where's the membership actually, rather than having leadership self-report back on their experience of what they experienced through the process? That's a lot cleaner data. Does that make sense? So that would be a really interesting one. Because I really think my hunch would be, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but my hunch would be, again, this is not all churches of Christ. Now, if you opened it up to all churches of Christ, you'd see some really interesting numbers, But it would seem to me that you might get a little more differentiation if you had members reporting on their comfortability with certain levels of change. Yeah, I would wonder that, at least. Again, we kind of went over this, but not entirely. 90% reported Scripture being majorly emphasized. 48% said the goal of making changes was to be more in line with Scripture. That's really important. 48%, the first thing they wrote down was Scripture. Because what do you hear? What do you hear? You know what I'm asking for.
More Scripture to do this.
Go ahead. You don't care about Scripture. Scripture must not mean anything to you.
That we're doing it to be popular.
Yeah.
That's my favorite one.
Well, hey, guess what? And again, this is self-report. There wasn't a single person in there that wrote to be popular, to be culturally relevant, to, these sorts of things. It was all giftedness, expressing the image and glory of God on a more holistic level, these sorts of things, right? Being faithful to what we believe Scripture is teaching. Because we believe Scripture teaches this, then we're going to do that. Not we believe this, so we're going to make Scripture say that, right? There's a difference in that. So this is in other words, this is based out of a scriptural conviction that this is the right change, not because we're just so immersed in the world that now we must view the Scripture to say this, and now we're and obviously that can happen. No, I'm not saying that can't happen, but no one seems to be, and maybe, would you say that? So preacher count, and I would love to actually gather some data on this. I was thinking like put a picture of like a single person on a picture and say, how many people do you see? And then have preachers answer, and then members answer. So you run an analysis and you say, was there any difference in averages on the numbers between preachers, elders, and members? There wasn't any average, and I just kind of found that was interesting. Preacher, and what you actually end up finding, I think, if you really got under this, is I think you would find everyone overestimates. I think. So in other words, how many people did you lose? My hunch is everyone overestimates, because it sure felt like, I would be curious to hear from you all, because my experience would be people leave to go to another Church of Christ. Anybody? I can't think of a single person I've ever known to just lose their faith over this. We had someone we're close to a while back say, wow, our church is really growing because the church across town made this change. And then I said, well, what are you going to do the first time they get frustrated in your church? That's a great point. So that kind of goes both ways. And you talk about risk and loss. Risk and loss is on both sides of the equation. There are some churches in the position of if you don't do anything, you're actually risking and you're losing if you do something. So that's just something to be considered. But thank you for bringing in that other side, because this is definitely there's bookends on this thing.
Have you noticed? Sorry.
I just got like 1 minute, so let me just say, okay, we'll catch up after though. Okay, if I don't catch you, let's catch up after.
Is your work published someplace or posted or something?
It's not, but I'll put it online. I'll probably put it at wineskins.org. Okay, thank you very much.
That's great.